Today I'm joined by my great colleague Alexandra Smart, and delighted that you can join me here today. We're going to dive into, a very conceptual idea, but I think an important idea. Alexandra, for those of you that may not have seen one of our other videos, has a fantastic background where not only is she formally trained, been to business school and studied in that sort of formalized way that we do, but also has a lot of practical, real business experience, life experience building Ginger and Smart, which became a very, very well-known and prosperous brand here in Australia that was ultimately sold to a private equity organization, but now today contributes to a broad range of organizations as a non-executive director, an advisor, and a fabulous coach as well. And I'm delighted that you're here. We're going to talk about this idea about showing up as a leader. And you and I talked in a previous video that we did about influence. And that led on to an even bigger idea about impact. And I'd encourage everybody, if you haven't seen that, to have a look at that, because Alex reframed the whole idea beautifully. But you referenced this idea about showing up as a leader, and it got us thinking about, okay, that's really interesting. I remember at one stage during my career, someone saying, if you want to be the managing director, you have to look like the managing director. And that was back in the day where the managing director wore a blue suit, white shirt, and a blue or red tie or something like that. But it was back in a day and an age, and that's kind of, and it was, with the benefit of hindsight, a very superficial sort of thing. But they were talking about, can they see the person in that role, I think was the essence of the idea. So let's unpack the sort of, the superficial stuff, what people see, and then what people hear, I guess, is the other way to sort of, like the behaviors and these sort of things, right? So is that too simplistic a way to even think about this, about thinking about how leaders show up, what they see and what they hear from leaders?
I think the way we show up as leaders is often something we don't think enough about. We may consider and think about, and I encourage the people that I coach to think about the kind of leader that they want to be. And they often say effective, resilient, impactful, kind, liked, which are more of the obvious cues of being a leader. Yeah. But what we don't necessarily think about when we're showing up as a leader is the non-verbal cues. In other words, how we're presenting, how we're speaking,
the
what
subtle
we're wearing.
Things, you mean, that people...
Or not so subtle.
Or not.
Or not so subtle.
Fair enough. Actually, that's a very good point. Okay, sorry, yes.
Because we're all, incredibly sensitive to non-verbal cues. And by non-verbal cues, I'm talking about the way we speak, the way we stand, the confidence with which we deliver information, what we're wearing, how we're presenting, which are all the non-verbal cues that influence the way people think of us as leaders.
I don't want to make this superficial like the way I started with the blue suit. However, I was speaking with the CEO of a very large, well-known brand here in Australia the other day, and he was talking about one of his direct reports. And he said, and this person is, comes from a field, and he said, he looks like where he's come from, right? Like the field, if you will. And yet now he's, reporting to the board, it's public, it's da-da-da-da, and there was a mismatch, and it seems like a superficial criticism, but he didn't look like it, in that way, and it wasn't like it was a bit incongruent, right? Because he was known for being a quality guy, but it was kind of a little bit out of fit, and it was described to me, and I asked for an example, and he said, the way he presents, like literally what he's wearing. In this particular case, it was about his shirt, funny enough. You know what I mean? It was kind of like it just didn't fit right. So I don't want to cheapen it and make it superficial, but like you come from a fashion, so you know the importance of this. So just am I missing something here?
Well, I don't think it's superficial at all, and I think it's multi-layered. So in that scenario, it's the opposite of the wear the suit as a managing director. The person that you're referencing who is not dressing and presenting and showing up in a way that fits in line with their seniority or their leadership or their position, that's incongruous and it's a mismatch. And So his reputation and his influence and his impact is being affected by that. So, you know, in order to step up to be where he needs to be in that organisation or that leadership role, that mismatch needs to be aligned, if you like. But I think it goes deeper than that. And what I mean by that is, you know, when in my fashion career as a fashion designer, we would think a lot about the way women, but it holds to men of course, it's gender non-specific, what I'm about to say, is that how you feel when you wear the clothes that you're wearing goes a huge way to how you present. And so we would spend a lot of time thinking about fabric, drape, colour, fit, all those sorts of things that either make a good outfit, in our case a dress, or a good suit. And what we were really wanting to do was to elicit an emotion within the people, the women that would wear our clothes, such that it became their armour. They could show up in the boardroom and own the boardroom. They could show up, you know, at lunch or you know, with friends or at events or with their teams in a leadership role, feeling like they were confident and they had their armour on. So it goes a long way to the psychology of performance.
It's fascinating that you say that, because I never really thought of it in that way. Of course, the blue suit, if you will, is just the modern day version of the uniform from war, which is where it came from, right? It was, you know, like if I'm a senior military officer, I wore a different suit than if I was an infantryman, by design. And you know, sometimes I got the things to show how senior I am and the stripes, and you still see it on pilots today, right? But I always thought of it as a sort of, okay, I know where you are, I know your seniority. I saw it as a uniform, almost a badge, right? Rather than what you're talking about, which is, well, that may be true. It's also, you thought a lot about how it makes you feel, and then how that then flows into a person's performance.
Another example is that we designed the Telstra uniforms at Gender and Smart. And we were asked to design, we were asked to design the uniform, but what we had to think about was how that person, the retail person in the Telstra store, was going to have a relationship with the customer. We wanted them to feel handsome, authoritative, confident. And so that was the starting point for the design.
Is that right?
So rather than, you know, inversely thinking about, you know, the usability of the colour or the fabric, it was actually how did we want that person to feel when they were wearing the garments.
Wow.
And so, you know, that's how we approached it, and consequently it was very successful. But you can use that analogy in the way you show up at work, wanting to feel confident and influential and all those sorts of things. If you turn up in cut-off shorts and a t-shirt, that's just not going to happen.
And everything's changed, you know, post-COVID as well. Like it's kind of like that reset a lot of.
Well, it's confusing because there's the hybrid, there's the mufti days, there's the come to work casual days, and you know, you see a different side of people when they show up at work looking completely different to, say, wearing a suit or more of a corporate attire. So the rules are changing, and it's not as easy. And there's also this whole really important now sustainability conversation about, well, how many more clothes do we really need, and let's use what we've already got, and that's an important conversation to have. But back to how do people use this conversation usefully, it's really aligning themselves as leaders with where they want to be and how they want people to view them and treat them and have confidence in them as a leader, and also the impact and influence that they want to have. And it's thinking about that and aligning those requirements and then showing up accordingly.
Before we get into the verbal aspects of this, I mean, are there other, so we've talked at some length about, you know, the non-verbal cues, if you will, like what we see and how we're dressed and the uniform and etc. Are there other sort of really obvious non-verbal cues that you think that we as executives give out to people?
Well, I think the way we communicate is you know, the tone of voice, eye contact, body language, all of those things are incredibly important in how we're perceived and how we can create influence. And often we forget that. One of the most important pieces of advice that I had early on in my career was I was in publishing, media, and I was in an office with a head of an advertising agency, and I was about 22, and I was sitting a bit like that. And my manager, when we left, said, "You must always sit in a meeting with your, as we are here today, showing interest, leaning in, being." And at the time, I was young, but I needed to hear that. And that, from that day forth, became part of who I am as a leader. I mean, I'm on it, right? So people need to be reminded, I think, and understand the importance of those non-verbal cues.
It's funny that you should say that, because my very first coaching client that I had was quite a senior project person delivering these large-scale projects. And part of the coaching brief was around that, is about his presence in group settings, in meetings, where it's senior, junior, whatever, and him sort of just visibly being in the back, in the back seat. I mean, like sort of not, and people read into that and thought, well, he's aloof, or he's not confident, or they read into something like that, and that was part of the original brief. So it's funny that you should raise that. So I think that's a really excellent, like non-verbal example of how we form impressions. Us humans, we form these superficial impressions based on what we see, which are often non-verbal, how we dress, our body language, and so on. Okay. Can we move? You've sort of already introduced to some extent, but the verbal. I almost don't know where to start with this, but what is the salient point here about the verbal part of our communication as managers and leaders? Like, what are the sort of, as you think about it, what are the really salient things that we should be mindful of?
Well, it's about communication and tone of voice and eye contact and authentically delivering messages. And so much is written into the way we carry ourselves, and not just what we're wearing, but the way we're carrying ourselves and the confidence with which we exude our message. And it's equally as important as the non-verbal cues. And what I would really, suggest and coach to leaders, emerging leaders and developing leaders, is that when they think about the kind of leader that they want to be, effective, resilient, and so forth, all those good words at the beginning of this conversation, is that to think about how they're showing up verbally, presenting themselves, and communicating, but also the non-verbal presentation of how they, and the impression that they want to leave, and the influence that they want to have, because it all rolls in together.
Seems to me too, the other dimension that complicates this is what's happening in their environment. So for example, the communication when there's a fire on is probably going to look a heck of a lot different than the communication that I'll use when I'm trying to innovate or develop a new product line, or, you know what I mean? So the context and the environment really perhaps influences that. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. It's almost like that adage that you have to wear several leadership hats all at once.
Yeah.
And the way you communicate and show up in a certain environment, in the boardroom, for example, with your armour on, is going to be different to how you show up for a company retreat or whatever, to extremes. So yes, you have to have the emotional intelligence to be able to read that and present in the way that's appropriate and authentic to the moment.
So this is really now starting to get to, people getting quite sophisticated with how they, sophisticated insofar as that requires a lot of awareness, self-awareness. It requires a lot of awareness of the environment and what's required, in this moment, in this context, et cetera, et cetera. And then for them to be sophisticated enough to adapt and augment, change, whatever, the style, communication, et cetera, to be effective. Yeah.
But that's leadership. It's complicated and messy and it's continuous learning, and it's always developing. And so you don't necessarily wake up one day having all these skills. It's something you have to learn and evolve, but also being strategic about it, and knowing that you need to show up at certain levels fast tracks your journey.
Excellent. So as you well know, we deal with really busy people, senior people, short of time, lots of demands, et cetera, et cetera. What are the big takeaways that you think that they should take away from this conversation that might be helpful in the work that they do?
Well, I think awareness is the first thing. Being aware of the reputation that you're building, the type of leader that you want to be, and how you need to step into that, and how you need to present yourself, and in an appropriate way, and in a way that allows your journey and your leadership journey to fast track. Because if you are not stepping into presenting yourself in a way that's appropriate to your level, then it's very difficult to have influence.
So this idea of how we show up, the core of that starts with obviously being aware by the sounds of things, and then from that you can sort of decide what it looks like verbally, non-verbally, and perhaps to be more deliberate with how you go about that.
And seek feedback.
And seek feedback. Brilliant. Thank you. That's a great reminder. As always, really enjoyed riffing with you on this. I think there's so much that we could explore with this particular topic. It's not straightforward, right? There's so many subtleties here, and impressions and judgments that are made that help and hinder careers. I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about it today. So thank you so much for sharing your perspectives.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.